Hello, welcome to the BuildASoil YouTube channel. Today we're going to be discussing worm bin setup and some of the theory behind it. So I'm just going to jump right in with a product that I'm going to set up. There are several reasons why you might want to start a worm bin. A number of people are starting to manage their waste more eco-friendly at home. So if you already have a recycling bin, you're doing one step, and then from there, a lot of people will start a compost pile. The other reason people are doing this is they realize that buying fertilizer, especially organic, and spreading it around their lawn, using it in their garden, using it for their cannabis, it can be expensive, and they can make a better quality product at home. And so some people will buy these and they'll have multiple bins, one for recycling, one for actually adding premium additives for flowering or for veg, and they kind of steer the direction of their vermicompost. And I want to share with you some of those ideas that you can maybe visualize a home setup. Part of the reason why I'm showing you this one is it's beautiful and it looks really good in your garage or your home, and that'll make it a little bit more acceptable, I think, in your daily routine. And most people could adapt to this and they'd be recycling right away. We're gonna do it here. I'll show you how. While I set it up, I wanna show you some of the basics for initial worm bin setup. And I printed out some papers on the average life cycle of the composting worm that we're gonna use, partially because a number of questions we get is, how many worms do I start with? Do I buy them at the grocery store or the gas station in the bait jar? Do I go online? Do I dig them out of the ground? I'm gonna try and hit those points while I unbox this. For right now, I'm just gonna open it here so it's easier for me to go through the directions and show you what it looks like when you open it up. You'll get this in the mail. It's $129 and it has free shipping. And there's a lot of history to these types of products. We used to sell a product called the Worm In, and that's no longer in business. This product's on the market, and I think it's better. And so we just decided to adapt it, to bring it in. I really, really like it. And it addressed a number of the concerns that we had as a home vermicomposter. So this is what it looks like. This is the actual lid. Pulls apart like this, and we're gonna hang it on the stand that comes with it. So I'm gonna toss this on the ground. I'm gonna grab all the items out and show you what's in here. We've got corners, they're all the same, so you don't have to guess. You just put them in all four corners, top and bottom. And then we have poles. There's one that is female and there's one that's male. You're able to put them together. I'm gonna build them on the ground right now, show you what it looks like, and we'll get it started. So now I'll set these up. It's pretty easy to see that there are 8 of these and only 4 of these. And if you think about it, it makes sense because there's 4 poles on top to make one square, 4 on the bottom to make another identical square. And there's only 4 that are the taller legs of the stand. And so if you have a rubber mallet, you could use that. But since they're plastic, I'm gonna go ahead and just start, grab them, and go like this. I'm gonna go ahead and take the urban worm bag and I'm gonna thread it through. These are really strong holders. If you already have one, maybe comment in here. Tell us some tricks that have worked for you, what you like about it. Do you have more than one? Okay, now the last step, this is where you harvest from. And so you'll wanna be familiar with attaching this and detaching this. This will also catch some of the moisture, as you're gonna wanna keep this optimally moist, or when you add food scraps, there may have some moisture that will start to leak out over time. You don't want it too wet, and so that's part of the process. I'll explain why we're setting one up on a stand, because it doesn't have to be. I used to have one, if you recall, that was just in a grassroots living soil pot. You can set one up in a bucket, in a bin, in a tub. There's a lot of ways. Here's where you're gonna harvest the castings out. You're gonna add the food to the top. Easy to harvest this way. So here's a flap that you're going to just pull this tight. Now that's gonna hold a lot of weight in it. So to keep the burden of weight off of that band that's very hard to open if it's been stressed, you have this additional product that Velcros on and buckles on to hold all the weight. So it's pretty intelligently built. And then these buckles really will hold it in case there's a lot of stress and weight on it. Once you get this on, it's kind of a pain the first time. You get a little bit better at it, and it really isn't hard. Okay, now when I dump my new material in to start this worm bin, it's not gonna just pour out onto the floor. However, if I want to capture castings in the future, I can put a bucket or a catch container underneath here. I want to discuss the benefits of a flow-through versus a regular worm bin. Clackamas Coot, Jim, he turned a lot of us onto the flow-through worm bin. Northwest Redworms is where you can buy a beautiful worm bin out of wood that's got a horizontal flow-through. He also sells plans to build your own. They're beautiful. I would highly recommend building something if you're really into it. Otherwise, this is the most economical way to start a flow-through. Now, what flow-through means is we're gonna put all our material inside, and this has got a zipper. The reason it's got a zipper is the worms don't like the light. This blocks the light. It keeps them working the whole top layer without having to put mulch in here unless you'd like to. It also keeps the fungus gnats out of the room or any of the little bugs that are part of the composting process. They're going to be there. They come in on your food scraps and everywhere else. So if this is, you know, in your bedroom or in your kitchen or something like that, the zipper design is really, really nice. Inside here, we're gonna load it up. Now, we're not gonna start full. That's not how this works. If you have a lot of waste, you could definitely set up multiple bins, but this will be at least 100 pounds, depending on how you set it up in the material. But we're gonna start fairly shallow, okay? And what we're gonna do is once we get to bedding, which is, they refer bedding as like a high carbon material. It can just be compost. It can be peat moss. It can be Coco Core. It can be shredded paper. You could run paper through the shredder like your junk mail. That could be the high carbon bedding. Some people are really pure about it. They don't want the ink that's in there, not knowing if it's plant-based or what, in their worm bin for their food. So that might be their recycling worm bin versus one they set up for production for the garden. I don't think you have to be that picky. The worms really do work through most any of these biological concerns or chemical concerns. Worms are very powerful, and the biology that goes on in here is powerful. But as they say, good in, good out. You don't have to worry about it if you start with clean inputs. And this might encourage you to eat a little bit cleaner at home, right? Organic food waste from organic farms, recycling through the process. It's really great, especially if you eat a higher plant-based diet, not quite as much meat and cheese waste. Almost everything can go in here. So consider that. Let me start with the bedding. Because that's oftentimes the questions that we get, and they also address it pretty well in this owner's manual that comes with it. I'll flip to here to see what they say. How does it work, right? What is vermicomposting? How to set it up for success. It says prepare bedding. Adding appropriate bedding is an important part of starting the worm bin. Whereas organic food waste is high in nitrogen, right? And it's gonna decompose quickly. The bedding is high carbon. That's what we just discussed. So it's really good to see they mirror how we think. Follow these, and it'll make it easier, but this is a video for anybody. So I'm gonna go over the basics, all right? So carbon decomposes more slowly, and it allows the contents in your worm bin to decompose at a moderate rate to prevent rotting and anaerobic conditions. So if you just fill this with vegetable scraps, it's gonna turn into liquid, putrid, black gnar really quickly, and it's gonna be too wet, okay? But if you have high carbon in here, wood chips and compost and paper or Coco Core or old potting soil that was peat moss based, they're gonna have this bedding and this carbon that will go with the food scraps to create a carbon to nitrogen ratio that makes really good finished compost. So you don't have to be an expert, but you have to know the basics, all right? In here they show a little bit of what looks like shredded cardboard. So, I mean, you could use whatever you'd like, right? Fill it roughly 1/5 of its volume with bedding and add bedding periodically as you add food waste. You can never have too much bedding, right? It's more about the likelihood of flies and all that. So if you have tons of gnats, tons of issues, it's too wet, you can add more bedding at that point. It's more carbon to kind of balance it back out. As long as you monitor it like nature, use your intuition, follow the BuildASoil way where we have attention to detail, and we're looking for things that are changing and seeing, as a steward, should I add more of this or add more of that? Use your best judgment. It says our recommendation is Coco Core. We're actually gonna use that. We're not huge proponents of Coco Core, but I found a brand that I like. One thing I do wanna address, they do talk about temperature, right? You don't want this out in the -20 degrees. You don't want it in 100 degrees. There's gonna be an optimal. I'll discuss that with the printouts when I discuss how many worms to buy, how quickly they multiply, because that's gonna be relative to optimal conditions, which I'll discuss. They talk about harvesting, which we already talked about. There's a drawstring underneath. You can harvest them in a bin, whatever you'd like, right? And here's like the getting started, 2 to 4 months in, 4 to 6 months in, you should have like a full worm bin, depending on how many worms you start in that process. Let me get to the tips that I wanted to discuss. What should I do about fruit flies or fungus gnats? A lot of people are really concerned. They can deal with almost anything. There's no odor in here, but if you get a gnat or two flying around your house or near your grow, it can be really annoying. The directions for this is the same as in the grow room. So they talk about Start by using a vacuum cleaner to get rid of the overpopulation. Makes sense. Some people do that in the grow room. They just get rid of a few of them off the floor. They get rid of them hovering. Remove the last layer of fresh organic waste. That'll have a lot of the larvae in there. Some people in the grow room, they're going to scrape their mulch layer if it's bad. Discard all of the larvae, apply a new mulch layer. This will prevent a lot of the problem by removing the larvae. And then it says add some more bedding and put a layer of paper on top. They're trying to bury it deep so that no new gnats can come in. Any larva that was left can't really come out. We can't always do that in a living soil container, but adding more of the mulch does balance the moisture issue, which sometimes is a byproduct of what got you there. So that might be a consideration. Okay, it says create a fly trap by putting a bit of apple cider vinegar and a drop of dish detergent, place it by the worm bag. That'll attract them, then they'll die in it. You can do that in the grow room as well. If they're still present, you can actually spray neem oil twice a day for 2 weeks. We carry some of the most potent neem oil on the market. We do a lot of research to make sure it's the best. It's 3, 4, 5 times as effective as some of the other products on the market by testing for its active components. And if you use it to spray, it actually is fine in living soil. You can spray just the surface, not watering, but misting the surface. And if you do it for a couple of weeks, it actually stops them. It says twice a day for 2 weeks. It's natural insecticide, quite effective, will not harm your worms, and we recommend it as a last resort. If you do that, it will stop the larva from developing. You can't just spray it once. Twice a day for 2 weeks, a lot of labor. So prevention is always the best. Otherwise, eradication can be hard. But that's it. Those are like the only problems. Once you've overcome that, you have the guide right here. You can get hundreds, if not thousands of dollars of premium worm castings with the freshest biology, predator mites, rove beetles, everything created right here in your own ecosystem. Kids love it. It feels good to recycle. So I just wanted to set this up, share some of my enthusiasm with you, and hope that it kind of rubs off on you. It's on our #1 go-to on BuildASoil, how to start your own worm bin. I think we say it 2 or 3 times because it's that important. Once you're using your own worm castings, you have such good biology and nutrients, and especially when you learn how to steer them. You could feed craft blend or high phosphorus amendments in here, and you could create your own flowering vermicompost from scratch. You could add high calcium, lots of ways to do this. The old books on farming, they discuss the key to large yields for these intensive production farms would be finding a mineral phosphorus source like Calphos. It's only 3% available, and if you have alkaline soil, it's unavailable. They would pre-compost it, unlock all of it, and they'd have to plan a year ahead to do so. Here, you can just sprinkle some in your worm bin. They're gonna create phosphatase to break it down. You're gonna have active enzymes. It's gonna make more phosphorus available. Everything that you research in the how to grow plants world can also be traced back to the worm bin. It's in here. All of the products that you buy stem from 1 or 2 things that come from a worm bin anyways. We're not doing this video because we think that you have to buy this product. We're doing this video because if you already are doing worms or you get into it, you're gonna appreciate the benefits that this offer in making it more consistent in your daily routine, easier to harvest, easier to add to. You don't have to do that. You can start with a fabric pot, a Rubbermaid tub. There are 1,000 ways to start your own worm bin without buying any product. When I go over the growth rates and you see what you can do with vertical flow through, where you can feed the top, harvest from the bottom without taking the worms out, I think you'll also see the benefit. We just care more about the recycling that goes on, the creation of the nutrients, and we want you to tap in. It doesn't have to be this. If you have the ability and you really like it, you want to step up and get one of these, we appreciate that too. So just address that right up front. And I'm going to grab a few products. And again, you don't have to use these. I talked about shredded paper, old potting soil. A lot of times you have discarded potting soil that maybe was from a last grow with root balls in it. Work that through. I'm gonna grab Coco Core for the bottom. I've got a knife and scissors. I'm just gonna open this up sideways because it was taped up. Now, the other thing is we need to add moisture. And so a lot of times you wanna do this before you actually get the worms. This is the Coco Core that we offer. This is the Conibo, and it's got a mixture of chunks and fine. I really like it. It makes a great texture, and I think it's gonna make a great bedding texture, but really, like I said, I would use just about anything right now. I'm kind of just recycling this because it was a torn bag. I'm gonna put the product in here. Now, it's a little bit dusty. I'm gonna grab the Chapin and I'm gonna spray. This is fairly aerated in the sense that it's got chunks and it holds lots of air in it. So the worms are gonna love it. Worms like the oxygen. And the red wigglers, they work the mulch layer where the leaves are decaying. So they like it where it's fairly aerobic. We don't want it to be heavy, wet, and nasty. But this depth works because eventually the worms go to the top where it is aerated, right? They're not gonna stay in the bottom. That's why we're building it in a shallow layer. They're gonna turn this into castings as we add food. They're gonna work their way up, and that's what it looks like on the box. That's the finished castings. There's not gonna be any worms down there because it's not aerated, it's too heavy and wet. And that's where the castings are gonna come out. Here's where the worms are, where it's aerated and oxygenated and happy and fresh food decaying and all of the actions happening. So that's why the flow through works, is the heavy volume in the bottom is where you're gonna harvest from, and they're kind of maturing before you drop them out. So don't fill it on day one, or you're defeating the entire process. But one thing to consider about that is that if you do have old potting soil, this is like a leftover bag that I'd scooped in and out of. I'm just gonna dump it. It's BuildASoil Light. I'll show you what it looks like. This is all dried out. It's been sitting open over here. So I'm gonna re-moisten it. But see the pumice that's in there? You don't have to take this out. I'm not selling these worm castings, right? A little bit of pumice going into wherever I apply it, it's not a problem, but I can also screen it out really easily. If I just have a little screen, which I often do with worm castings to get those really pure castings, you can screen them yourself and screen the pumice out, throw it back in. But what the pumice does is it adds that same aeration. Just like in our potting soil, the worms absolutely love it. It'll keep it from getting totally anaerobic in the bottom, and you don't have to add it. But Coot always recommended, make the compost, add some pumice, aerate it so the worms go crazy. I'm gonna mix this up just a little bit, and then I'm gonna add some moisture to it, and that's about it. And then as I start to add the worms, I'm gonna add like a food layer on top so things start to break down. I've also got some fresh castings in there. The castings are gonna add a lot of biology, predator mites, things like that that are gonna start breaking this down. The moisture is gonna be there. I'm gonna water this down, get it to the optimal moisture. It's J-Plant Speakers, Q-Yaha extract powder. And I'm gonna use this because it's high in saponin. You don't have to use this. Basically, if I just wet this, the water's gonna run through. It's like bone dry. It's been sitting as an open bag. So I added a little bit of this to the water. All I'm doing is helping it spread the moisture out. If you don't have a wetting agent like this, water slowly, use mist or water it in. Worst case, you can put a bucket underneath there and you can collect the water. It will catch in the catch container and it'll redistribute. A good rule of thumb when it's bone dry is shooting that 10% range. So it looks like I added about 4 gallons of material. So 40% of a gallon, 4/10, so not quite half a gallon, is probably what'll optimally bring the moisture level up in here. Treat it just like you would a plant that you're growing. You don't want it over wet like mud. You don't want it bone dry. A lot of times when I use a mister like this, it'll look wet and I'll dig down and it's still dry. Make sure it's wet to the bottom and not soaking wet, and we're done. We're basically ready to put our worms in. That's what I'm gonna do right now. All right, you can see that it's kind of that white foam right there. That's the cue. And it just foams up so that the water doesn't just dump out the bottom, and it doesn't hurt the worms at all. It's beneficial in a number of ways. I'm not gonna like feed the worm bin this product all the time, but I just didn't want water dumping out everywhere. And I'll show you what I mean. See how it's soaking wet? I've actually watered quite a bit. Right there, it's bone dry. Look at that, just barely under the surface. Partially because the cue is holding the water, partially because it's just bone dry and it's gonna take a while. So I'm gonna keep going. And even though I'm spraying, it's not even been a quarter gallon yet. If you stir it together, all the moisture is gonna be forced to absorb into the material and it'll more evenly disperse it. Time also works. So you can just do this, come back 20 minutes, do it again, and it'll evenly work its way through the entire bin. Again, worms like it moist, but they also like it oxygenated. They also like it dark. So this has all of that. It's not gonna go anaerobic nearly as easy as like a plastic bin. Those are things to consider. So if you have a plastic bin, you don't want too much moisture. You want to kind of err on the side of caution because the plastic bin is going to never breathe. It'll hold all the moisture you put in till the worms get really active and you add more carbon material. So if you add too much water, I can throw some more bedding in here and it would absorb it and I'd be fine. So just consider that. See, it's still dry. So I'm just going to keep adding this until it's all done. Probably going to do this whole thing. When it's that dry, it's probably going to take a little more than 10%. Usually with potting soil, if it's already the right moisture, 5–10% will do it. What I mean by that is the number of gallons of water by percentage. Either way, you could also do this in a separate bin, make sure it feels right, dump it in. I'm gonna get my hands in here, make sure that I mix it up just a little bit. Now that that's in there, I'm gonna grab the worms. In here, Reader was nice enough to put some of our blue oyster straw log that he had. We use for mulch. We offer this here, it's full of fungus. The worms love it. You don't have to use this. A lot of times if you have an open bin outdoors, you'll just put a huge layer of mulch. That'll protect them from the weather, kind of put a cap on it and keep the light out. You don't have to do that in here, but I'm just gonna dump it all in anyways. This is more bedding material, right? High carbon. So I'll dump it in. We'll see if we can show you some worms in there. There's baby worms, adult worms, all sorts of stuff, some beautiful castings. The castings are gonna be kind of like the beginning biology. A lot of the biology from Reader's worm bin is already in here. So when I put this in here, it's gonna kickstart the biology and it'll reproduce in here. Plus there's worms, there's adults, there's juveniles, there's probably a few cocoons in here. Let me get the rest of these out since there's some castings and some worms in here. I wanna make sure I get them all. That's what the worm bin looks like. Eventually, this is what the castings are gonna look like that come out of here. That was from a worm bin that came with the worms, and these are what we're after. The small black compost that comes from this is full of available biological nutrients that it's really a powerhouse. Now, the quality of the nutrient comes from the feedstock. I'm gonna feed them right now, and then I'm gonna grab a chart that's gonna explain a little bit about the growth rate, how many to add, that kind of thing. This is the Clackamas Coots gnarly barley. This is some sprouted hemp. It's also got sprouted barley, the malted barley, right? And it's got sprouted organic corn. And the combination, really any sprouted seed, it's gonna have tons of enzymes. And we explained that enzymes are the way that worms break things down. So this is gonna add a ton of enzymes, also the nutrition from the seeds. Seeds have tons of nutrition, that's why we feed them to animals. So this is gonna be kind of that nitrogen content that we're talking about. It's also gonna kickstart the biology like crazy in here. Normally I'd grind it up, but these worms will go through it just fine as the biology breaks it down, and I'm only gonna put a tiny bit in here. That'll start a few seeds actually. We're actually updating the recipe, and we're gonna be replacing the hemp with lentils, mainly because hemp can sprout even after it's been sprouted. It's an incredible seed, but sprouted seeds, great feed because of the enzymes to add to your worm bin. There we go. This is a table that's from Vermiculture Technology, which is a book that Coot recommended to us, and it's available on PDF. It's like a textbook, if you will. It goes over the growth rates. I'm gonna talk about these numbers. This, if you Google worm calculator, worm growth calculator, you can find these calculators online where you literally put the starting number of worms, and it projects how long it's gonna take to multiply the cocoons, the baby worms, the adult worms, and it's fascinating. And if you have the right temperature in here, it grows at optimal rate. If you start with 1,000 worms, you're gonna have thousands more than that relatively quickly. And if you put too many worms, like if you just go buy 10 pounds of worms and put them in here, it's a waste of money because they multiply so quickly, but also it's too many. It's gonna lower their growth rate below optimal because they're already overcrowding their environment, and nature's smart like that. If they eat everything too fast, there's none for any, and they'll go extinct, so to speak. So they will kind of self-balance according to their population. So starting with less is ideal. Now, here's what I did. So I ran one chart with 20 adult worms, 10 baby worms, and 5 cocoons. There's probably a few more than that, probably 30, 40 worms. So if we were to start with only a handful like that, and we project out to 85, 90 days here, you can see that we'd have 1,250 worms at the very end of that 90 days. So over 3 months, we'd have 1,250 worms, and they're gonna exponentially grow after that. Now that takes into consideration optimal temperature, 77 degrees, optimal moisture, 80 to 85%. If they're in that optimal temperature, optimal moisture level, which means they have the right amount of air in there, they're going to grow at that rate. When you go buy a pound of worms, if they're all adults, you get 825 worms in a pound of red wigglers. Some are gonna be adult, some are gonna be juvenile. That's why most say a pound on average is about 1,000 worms. If you start with only 30 or 40 worms like that, it's gonna take me 90 days if I leave it here to get up to the 1 pound starting point. Of course, it's a lot cheaper to only source a few worms for free. So now that you know the growth rate, now that you know it might be better to start with a few more worms and it all will go faster, how do we get worms? A lot of people we talk to, they go to like the gas station and get the bait worms. If you do that, they're usually the large, either clay worms or they're gonna be African night crawlers. Those are fine, but I prefer the red wigglers because in a flow-through bin, they're gonna work this mulch layer better. Also in our living soil containers, they work that mulch layer better. The night crawlers will go a little bit deeper. Some like to do both, but in this bin, I'd like to harvest from the bottom and have only the activity up top. So I'd recommend red wigglers for your home worm bin. If I go to the bait guy and I get a container of worms and they are red wigglers, there might only be 30, 40 worms in there, 20, 30 worms. So again, you might be starting with a small amount like this. Now, if you go outside and you just dig them out of the ground, those are gonna be more earthworms, not composting worms, and they're not what we want. The red wigglers are typically referred to as Esinida fetida or the manure worm. So the manure worm, it's more likely that if you find some old manure and you find little red worms in there, those are the composting worms that you want, and you can get them for free if you know where to find them. Otherwise, you might look on Craigslist to find a local worm guy. Research Northwest redworms. We discussed them because he was often referred to by Coot as a really quality source, a good person that produced worm castings in the Pacific Northwest. That being said, we bought lots of worms from them and we kind of outpaced his capability, but the quality was phenomenal the entire time. So I'd highly encourage you to reach out. Some of the best cared for. It was almost like pets showed up. The bag was perfect. They had holes in it. It breathed well. But online, anywhere you can find, a lot of times it's more about who has them in stock. Buy a pound. I wanna say they're around $30 to $40 for a pound of worms with the shipping built in, depending on where you go. BuildASoil doesn't carry worms right now. It's hard for us to keep them in stock. If we turn on a new worm supplier, a lot of times we'll sell them out in a couple days. So if you know somebody that does sell red wigglers and has a good supply, takes care of them, loves their worms, we'd love to have a good contact so we could share that source on our website. Otherwise, start your own worm bin. You can become the source. You can become the plug, sell your worms to your buddies, use your own castings. You don't have to have just this one. On the same day, you could set up multiple bins. One could be for shredding all of the junk mail that you get and paper waste, and you could process that as your bedding in all of them and some of them. You could recycle all your food scraps, coffee grounds, anything like that in one of your bins, where another you might feed gnarly barley, craft blend, calthos, fishbone meal, high phosphorus, flowering type of additives, and that could be your flowering worm castings per se. So I encourage you to think about steering your worm casting production, and it might add a huge cost benefit, yield and quality benefit to your garden, and it's all start to finish from the compost bin all the way to harvest from you. So check it out. It's part of the BuildASoil way. Set up your own worm bin. So I want to encourage you to try, even if you've tried in the past. I think this will make it easy. Or try a fabric pot. That also breathes and it makes the whole process easier. Overwatering is typically the #1 downfall of the worm bin. And then I promise, some point in the future, we'll do a follow-up video where I address the bin getting more full. I show you the population of worms, and we'll probably go on a harvest day showing you how we get the castings out and use them. Thanks for your time. As always, I appreciate you watching. Like, subscribe, tell your friends, comment on here, get that interaction going. It helps us help you, and we really love the support.